The 70s were a very different time to grow up as an American kid. No Netflix, no TikTok. Just a few shows that really stayed with you, and The Electric Company was one of them. It taught kids how to read with music, with sketches, with knowledge, and with creativity. But The Electric Company was not just some simple children's show. There was a whole pile of weird facts around it that back then kids like us never noticed, and a lot of adults probably did not either. A Spider-Man turned into a silent superhero just to force kids to read. A show that got criticized for being too loud, too fast, too much all at once. And a title that originally sounded so dry, no kid would ever want to run toward it. Today we are going to dig up the 20 craziest facts about the Electric Company. And trust me, the deeper you go, the stranger this show gets than anybody ever thought. Number 20. The Electric Company was actually a television experiment designed to teach kids how to read. Back then, none of us sat in front of the screen thinking we were about to get taught how to read. No kid thought that way. What we saw was just a show that was way too loud, way too full of music, way too packed with weird little sketches, way too full of energy. Like that tiny screen was about to blast right out of the wooden box in the living room. The grown-ups looked at it in a much simpler way. They saw it as a respectable show, appropriate, useful, something you could just turn on for your kid and leave there. It was only years later, looking back, that people realized how strange that really was. The Electric Company was not built just to entertain children. It started in 1971 with a very specific goal to help kids from 7 to 10 read better, especially 2nd, 3rd, and 4th graders who were still struggling with words. Really, it was a television experiment meant to teach reading, except it disguised itself so well under music sketches and laughter that kids never felt like they were being taught anything at all. And maybe that was the smartest thing about the whole show. Looking back now, we were lucky to grow up in a time when people still tried to teach kids to read with music, with sketches, and with imagination, not with TikTok. Number 19. The Electric Company turned Spider-Man into a silent superhero. I have to admit something, I only really noticed this not that long ago. When I was a kid, all I knew was that if Spider-Man showed up, I had to sit right up close to the screen. That was it. I was not sitting there to analyze anything. It was only later that I stopped and thought, good Lord, they really took Spider-Man and stripped away his voice. And that is the weirdest part. In The Electric Company, Spider-Man almost never spoke out loud. The writers and the educational advisors decided to have him communicate through word balloons just like in comic books. That already sounds strange enough, but that strangeness served a very clear purpose if kids wanted to keep up with Spider-Man. They had to read. Looking back now, that was an incredibly sneaky trick. Back then, I never felt like I was practicing reading. I thought I was watching a superhero do superhero stuff. But really, every time I looked up and read those little lines above his head, the show had quietly made me do exactly what it wanted. And that is still not even the strangest part. Let's go to number 18, and you are going to be shocked by the truth behind the show's name. Number 18, this craziest show of our childhood was originally just called the Reading Program. There are some things that get funnier. The older I get, in my memory, The Electric Company is that music kicking on like a switch, those little sketches flying across the screen, that loud, wild energy that gave a kid no choice but to sit still and stare. And yet, at first, that show was called something that sounded like a paper handed out by the school office, the Reading Program. Just hearing that makes it sound like every kid would want to run from it the way they run from school. And then, thankfully, somewhere in the middle of making it, somebody came up with a much better name, The Eclectic Company. Paul Dooley said that because the production team kept talking over and over about how eclectic the show was going to be, meaning all kinds of reading methods, all kinds of teaching styles. They started joking around with that word. Out of that joke, the name slid into The Electric Company, and suddenly everything sounded like it had a spark running through it. Honestly, if they had kept the name The Reading Program, I do not think any of us would have rushed toward the screen the way we did. But The Electric Company was different. It sounded like something that could light up the whole living room. And the funniest part is that once it got the better name, the show actually proved it worked. That is when the story gets a whole lot more interesting. Number 17. This loud, crazy show really did help kids read better. The thing that surprises me most is not how fun the show was. It is that it actually worked. Back then, if you asked a kid sitting there watching The Electric Company, they would never say they were taking part in some educational experiment. All they saw was music sketches, words bouncing all over the screen, everything moving fast, like a generator that was about to start smoking. And yet, when adults brought that chaos into schools and actually measured it carefully, the results were real. The first-year evaluation report showed that classes watching the show in school improved more clearly than classes that did not watch it in exactly the reading skills the program was targeting. The even stranger part is that the group who benefited the most was exactly the group that needed it most. The biggest effect showed up in second graders in the lower half of the class in reading level, and in Fresno, that target group outperformed the non-viewing group in 17 out of 19 skill areas. In just the first 2 months after the show launched, nearly a quarter of the schools with the target grades had already started using it. Which means the adults back then looked at this whole noisy mess and said, all right, keep it on, this thing is actually helping. Weird and honestly kind of amazing. Number 16. Bill Cosby turned the Electric Company into part of his road to a doctorate. This is where the story suddenly swerves in a completely different direction. The Electric Company was supposed to be a show that taught kids to read, but for Bill Cosby, it also became part of his academic path. Cosby got a master's degree in education in 1972, then earned an Ed.D. from UMass Amherst in 1976. He himself said that his experience working with the Electric Company and Sesame Street shaped the way he thought about television as an educational tool, and his dissertation also centered on using Fat Albert and the Cosby Kids as a way to support learning in elementary schools. But can you believe it? The more uncomfortable part is that degree later came under heavy scrutiny. Reginald Damrell, someone who had served on the dissertation committee, said Cosby hardly attended school in the normal sense and was given credit for his television work itself, including The Electric Company. At the same time, Cosby said he had completed every requirement he was given, and UMass at the time also said he had not received any special treatment. There were even more serious accusations later about how he completed his studies, but that part is not as clear as the disputes that were publicly documented. Number 15. Behind the Electric Company was a real battle between comedy and curriculum. Do not think the Electric Company was made by a bunch of people who were all nodding along with each other. This show lived off a real tug of war. On one side were the writers and television people, the ones who wanted everything faster, funnier, weirder, and entertaining enough that kids would forget to even blink. On the other side was the curriculum team, the people staring at every single word and asking just one question: can the kids read it? It sounds polite enough, but try imagining sitting in a writer's room and turning the consonant blend FL into 2 minutes of comedy. Some people from the show remembered that just that alone was enough to drive writers crazy. Barbara Fowles even said a lot of the writers' wordplay really flew way too high over the heads of kids who were already struggling to read. The character Fargo, North Dakota is the clearest example. Adults loved that joke. A lot of kids just looked at it and did not catch a thing. Number 14. They made 130 episodes a season. Numbered them right on screen and turned the show into a textbook. When I was a kid, I was not sitting there thinking about production schedules. I just felt like the Electric Company was always there, always full of words, full of music, full of the people running in and out, like the whole thing would never run out of power. It was only later that I realized the real madness was in the machine behind it. They made 130 episodes every season. 6 seasons. 780 episodes. That is not the rhythm of a normal children's show anymore. That is the rhythm of a factory. The episodes did not even use normal titles. They were numbered right on screen, with the first 4 seasons running from 1 to 520. Then Season 5 becoming 1A to 130A, and Season 6 becoming 1B to 130B. That cold, almost mechanical feel got even clearer in the final 2 seasons because they were no longer just television seasons. They were designed as a full-year curriculum for schools, almost like a broadcast textbook. In other words, by that point, The Electric Company was not just a show anymore, it was an educational machine disguised as laughter. And once you hear that kind of scale, the next question almost jumps right out, so how much did that whole machine cost? Number 13, one episode of The Electric Company cost. Only about $32,000, way cheaper than commercial kids' TV. There are some numbers that make me doubt my own eyes. On screen, The Electric Company always looked like it was spending serious money. Music sketches, animation words, flying everywhere, actors moving in and out non-stop, not to mention the whole research and classroom support system behind it. No matter how you looked at it, it did not feel cheap. And yet, according to a CTW document from 1976, the average cost for one episode was only about $32,000. That already sounds strange. Even stranger, that number was way lower than a lot of half-hour commercial children's shows from the same era, which were around $70,000 an episode. In other words, this show that looked like a television storm actually ran a whole lot leaner than many of the things made for Saturday morning. That is where I really admire The Electric Company. It was not just wild on screen. It was disciplined on paper, too. Every season, the money did not just buy 130 broadcast episodes, it also bought research evaluation and work outside the classroom. So the closer I look, the more I understand why years later people were still willing to pour more money into bringing that name back. Number 12. Decades later, The Electric Company was still given nearly $6 million to come back to life. Some shows live only in memory. People remember them, mention them, and leave it there. The Electric Company was not like that. After many quiet decades, that name still had enough power to make people open their wallets again. When the new version was revived, it received nearly $6 million from the U.S. Department of Education's Ready to Learn initiative. PBS also confirmed this was not some comeback just for nostalgia. It was part of a literacy strategy for children. You see how weird that is too, right? Nobody pours that much money in just because a few grown-ups want to sit around remembering their childhood. The name The Electric Company got revived because it was still seen as useful, especially for kids who needed literacy support and for families that did not always have enough learning resources. And the irony is that even with that kind of revival, a lot of people still misunderstood it from the start, assuming it was just another version of a show meant for younger kids. That was actually a huge misunderstanding. Number 11. A lot of people think The Electric Company was just Sesame Street for all ages, but that is a big misunderstanding. This is where a lot of people remember it wrong. They look at The Electric Company, see the colors, see the music, see the familiar faces from the same educational television world, and automatically think it was just another version of Sesame Street for everybody. But it was not. Right from the start, Sesame Workshop said very clearly that the show was created in 1971 to address a literacy crisis among kids ages 7 to 10. The American Archive puts it even more clearly. It focused on 2nd through 4th graders and was designed to go straight into classroom instruction. And if this is the moment you are realizing you have remembered this show wrong all these years, too, hit like on this video before we head into the second half of the list, because from here down, things only get stranger. Number 10. The Electric Company ended with a farewell song, but Rita Moreno was missing. There are details I never noticed as a kid. The final episode of The Electric Company, episode 130B, ends with a goodbye number that feels exactly like a farewell, should the song "We're Glad You Came to Call." Everything should have felt complete in that moment. This was the show taking one last bow for the audience, and yet even in that goodbye, Rita Moreno was not there. That is the part that feels strange to me, because when you think about The Electric Company, you can almost never separate Rita Moreno's name from the memory of the show. She was one of its brightest faces, strongest presences, biggest personalities, so when the show sings its final goodbye, without her, it does not exactly feel wrong. It just feels a little incomplete. A small empty space, but once you notice it, it is hard to ignore. What is even stranger is that in that closing number, Réjean Magloire was wearing the outfit Rita had worn in the first episode. So that final scene almost calls Rita back to mind without actually having like the real Rita there. And sometimes I think that is exactly the kind of thing that makes an ending stay with you longer. Not because of the people standing on stage, but because of the person who should have been standing there and was missing. Number 9. The Electric Company only gave you the full opening and credits on Fridays. Man, you were probably just like me. Back then, you were not sitting there studying on the opening or the credits. You were just watching. The show started, the words came flying out. Somebody yelled, the music kicked in, and everything came charging at the screen like a train that had already left the station. But looking back as an adult, I realized the Electric Company was strange even in that little detail. Its full opening and full credits were mostly tied to the Friday episodes. The rest of the week, the show usually jumped into the content faster, like from Monday to Thursday, there was no need for any ceremony at all. Just go ahead and start the lesson. It sounds small, but it gives me this weird, wistful feeling. Because all of a sudden, the whole show starts to feel like a real school week. All week long, it rushes straight into the main business. Then by the end of the week, it lets you breathe a little and see the full frame around it. Back then, I never noticed. Now, when I think about it, even the opening of the Electric Company had its own rhythm to it. And once you start noticing that the way this show numbered its episodes starts to look even stranger. Number 8, the way the Electric Company numbered its episodes made it feel more like a curriculum than a TV show. The way a show numbers itself can sometimes tell you more about it than the introduction ever could. The Electric Company did not title its episodes the way normal TV shows did. It numbered the whole series like some kind of operating system. The first 4 seasons ran straight from 1 to 520. Then Season 5 switched to 1A through 130A. Season 6 became 1B through 130B. That made 780 episodes total, exactly 130 episodes per season. It does not sound like episode titles. It sounds like file codes, lesson plans, or a machine dividing up work shifts, and that is where the story really gets weird. Those last 2 seasons did not add the A and B just to make it look cute. They were designed as full-year curriculum packages for schools, which means from that point on, the show almost stopped pretending it was just entertainment. It showed its real skeleton. This was a learning tool. It was just wrapped in music sketches and laughter, so kids never felt like they were sitting inside a textbook. And any time a machine runs that steady and that big, sooner or later, it is going to start overheating. And in the next one, that is exactly what happened. Number 7. The first season of The Electric Company got criticized for being too loud, too fast, and too much all at once. No, the problem with the first season of The Electric Company was not that it was slow or dull. The problem was that it came at the audience like it had just chugged down a whole tank of electricity. In just 30 minutes, the show tried to cram in 5, sometimes even 6, teaching goals, then covered the whole thing with rock music, rapid cutting, and an energy that almost refused to stand still. Some people on the advisory board looked at it and basically said exactly what you are probably thinking: too much noise, too much going on, too much rock and roll, too much chaos. And honestly, for a show called The Electric Company getting criticized for having too much electricity, sounds kind of perfect in a funny way. The nice thing is they did not try to argue with that. They looked at that overheated machine and actually eased off the gas. By the next season, the number of goals in each episode got cut down to 3 or 4, and the whole show had a little more breathing room. In other words, the Electric Company had to learn how to stop yelling so kids could keep up. And when a show starts controlling itself down to the rhythm like that, it is not surprising to find out it even paid attention to the font of every word that showed up on the screen. Number 6, the Electric Company was so careful, it even picked a special font just for Spider-Man. Some shows use words just to pass along information. The Electric Company did not work like that. This show was so carefully put together that even the style of the words on screen had its own job. The font that showed up most often was Franklin Gothic, a strong, clear typeface that worked great for words that needed to hit kids right between the eyes. But when Spider-Man spoke through his word balloons, the show switched to Dom Casual. That detail alone tells you they did not treat words like decoration. They treated words like part of the performance. And the funny part is kids back then were not sitting in front of the screen saying to each other, "Oh, Spider-Man is using a softer font today." But their eyes still felt the difference. Franklin Gothic made the words look clear and serious. Dom Casual felt more playful, more at home in the comic book world. The Electric Company was not just teaching kids how to read words. It was teaching them how to feel words with their eyes before they ever said them out loud. Number 5. Before she sang Fame. Irene Cara was just a kid in the short circus. When you looked at the short circus back then, what did you see? A group of teenagers singing, dancing, making the Electric Company light up every time they showed up. What you did not see, at least not at the time, was that Irene Cara was in that group. That is right before all of America knew her from Fame, before that voice got tied to Flashdance. What a feeling. She was just a young member of the house band on this show. The Television Academy lists Irene Cara as being part of the short circus from 1971 to 1972, which means she was there in the show's very early years. That is exactly the kind of fact that makes me love the Electric Company. It stops feeling like just a children's show. It starts feeling like one of those places where young talent passed through very early before the rest of the world even knew the right name for them yet. And if a voice like Irene Cara started to bloom here, that actually makes perfect sense, because with the Electric Company, music was never just decoration, it was part of the lesson. Number 4, in the Electric Company, music was not decoration. It was a reading method. If you pull the music out of the Electric Company, you do not just make the show less fun. You take away part of the lesson too. CTW said very clearly that music was an important way to bring literacy goals onto the screen. And with this show, they deliberately used original music instead of patching together existing songs. The lyrics were often written by the writing staff themselves, and then composers like Joe Raposo, Gary Friedman, and Dave Conner turned them into songs. The part I admire most is this tiny little detail that was also incredibly clever. Dave Conner said that when he wrote music for a reading show, he tried to place the words being taught on the strong beats of the song. In other words, they were not writing music just to fill the empty space between two sketches. They were writing music so the words would hit kids right in the ear at the exact moment they would be easiest to remember. One teacher even said students were able to tell the difference between Kit and Kite because of a fast little rock jingle, instead of sitting through months of dry phonics lessons. And when music can do that, it makes perfect sense that in the first year alone, a whole lot of elementary schools turned on the TV and let this show walk right into the classroom. Number 3, in the first season alone. Nearly a quarter of elementary schools turned on the Electric Company in class. Forget the living room. There was a point when the Electric Company marched straight into classrooms at a speed that makes you blink. Not long after the show premiered, nearly a quarter of the public and private schools with the target grade levels had already put it to use. CTW's own summary materials gave the specific number as 18,811 schools in just about the first 2 months. And in places where the program was actually available, the penetration rate climbed to about 45%. Just think about that. A show full of music sketches and television energy got pulled straight into schools that fast. That alone is strange enough. And when a show manages to get into classrooms while also keeping kids glued to the screen, it is no surprise that in the next one, the people behind it started getting recognized by the television industry itself. Number 2, the Electric Company was not just remembered. It also reached the Emmys. A lot of childhood shows live off memory. The Electric Company went further than that. It was not just remembered by audiences, it was seen by the television industry too. Jeremy Stevens, one of the people who helped build the show later, won an Emmy for the work he did here. The Electric Company itself also got nominated in the children's programming category, and that says something very clear. This was not just the kind of thing people turned on to keep kids sitting quietly in front of the screen. It was a show that was genuinely seen as a creative achievement. And if you think that is already strange enough, the final fact is the prettiest, closer on this whole list. Are you ready? Number 1 by the end. The electric company was moving faster because it reused old sketches. This is probably my favorite ending of all because it shows just how smooth a machine the electric company had become by the finish line. In the early years, it took the crew around 26 weeks of production to build a full season of the show. But by season 6, which was also the final season, that stretch had been cut down to about 13 weeks. The reason was not that they had gotten less ambitious. The reason was that the show had built up enough material to start reusing sketches from earlier seasons in a way that looked a whole lot like the model CTW had already used with Sesame Street. CTW materials also show that reusing older material was a very real part of life inside the workshop's production system, and the electric company itself had been scheduled from the beginning, like a pipeline that could complete 130 half-hour programs in a short production season. In other words, by the end of the road, this show did not just teach kids to read better, it also learned how to run itself more intelligently. And that is a beautiful ending for a program that spent its whole life turning chaos on a screen into something genuinely useful. In this age of Netflix, TikTok, and everything moving so fast, you barely remember one scene before the next one sweeps it away. I find myself missing a very different kind of era, when a show like The Electric Company could be loud, weird, funny, and still leave a mark in your head for a very long time. Honestly, digging up secrets like these feels just like digging for treasure. You peel back one more layer, and there is another detail, another old name, another story you thought had sunk away that turns out to still be shining right there. Now I want to hear from you. What movie or show do you want me to dig into next? In the next video, drop your suggestion in the comments below. And do not forget to subscribe so you do not miss more trips back into the past like this one. See you next time.